Something happened in Beijing yesterday that the mainstream financial press is still trying to wrap their heads around. A handshake took place between two men whose countries collectively control the economic fate of billions of people, and tucked inside that handshake was a quiet signal to Tehran that may be the most consequential geopolitical moment of 2026. Nobody's connecting the dots on what this actually means for oil markets, for your gas bill, for global shipping, and for the balance of power in the most dangerous stretch of water on Earth. Iran just lost something it has been counting on for years, and the world doesn't fully realize it yet. Here's what we know. The Strait of Hormuz has been effectively closed since late February. The IRGC shut it down after US and Israeli strikes killed Iran's top leadership. Roughly 20% of the world's seaborne oil used to move through that narrow channel every single day. Since it closed, gas prices in America have climbed more than $1 per gallon. Brent crude briefly touched $95 a barrel. The International Energy Agency called it the largest supply disruption in the history of the global oil market. Airlines raised baggage fees because jet fuel spiked 95% in North America. And in the middle of all of this, with the world economy bleeding, Donald Trump flew to Beijing. And what came out of that room changes everything. But here's the part the headlines are missing entirely. This is Professor John, and if this is the kind of analysis you want before anyone else is talking about it, hit that subscribe button now, because what we're about to break down is not being fully reported anywhere. Let's start with what actually happened in Beijing, because the framing matters enormously. The press covered it as a trade summit. A few journalists flagged the Taiwan comments. But the single most strategically significant outcome of the Trump-Xi meeting on May 14th was not about tariffs, not about semiconductors, not about Taiwan. According to the White House readout issued yesterday, both presidents agreed that the Strait of Hormuz must remain open to support the free flow of energy, and both agreed that Iran can never have a nuclear weapon. Xi Jinping publicly opposed the militarization of the strait. He publicly opposed any Iranian tolling system for passage through that waterway, and then, this is where it gets seismic, Xi expressed interest in purchasing more American oil, specifically to reduce China's dependence on the Strait of Hormuz in the future. Read that again. The largest buyer of Iranian oil on the planet just told the United States it wants to buy American oil instead. That's not a trade deal. That's a civilizational pivot. Trump told Fox News' Sean Hannity from Beijing that Xi had said, and I'm paraphrasing closely, that China would not provide military equipment to Iran, and Trump himself called that a big statement, because it is. Xi also told him, according to Trump, that China wants to keep buying Iranian oil, yes. But when you combine that admission with everything else, the public opposition to militarization, the interest in U.S. crude, the joint nuclear statement, what you're really watching is Beijing carefully, deliberately, and very publicly beginning to create distance from Tehran, not cutting the cord, but fraying it, strategically, on a global stage. Now here's the real question. Why does any of this matter to your finances, to American markets, to the global economy right now? Because China is not just Iran's biggest customer. China is Iran's lifeline. Iran has been exporting roughly 1.38 million barrels of oil per day to Chinese buyers. That's according to trade intelligence firm UNTHINKABLE, which tracks actual tanker movements. China's official customs data shows zero imports from Iran since 2023, which tells you everything about how this game is played. Those barrels move through ghost ships, through ship-to-ship transfers near Malaysia and Indonesia, relabeled as Malaysian crude, sometimes Indonesian or Omani crude. The whole architecture of Iran's sanctions evasion runs straight through Beijing's willingness to look the other way, and for years Beijing did, because cheap discounted Iranian oil kept Chinese refineries humming. But think about what's changed. The Strait of Hormuz has been closed for over 2 months now. Half of China's total crude oil imports and nearly a third of its LNG used to move through that waterway. That's an existential energy security problem for Beijing. The world's largest oil importer suddenly can't access the bulk of its supply through the most critical shipping lane on Earth. China had stockpiles, about 1.39 billion barrels in storage as of early March, roughly 120 days of net imports. But that clock is ticking. And Iran, the country that triggered this closure in the first place by blockading the strait in retaliation for US and Israeli strikes, is now the source of China's pain as much as anyone else's. This is where the leverage calculation flips completely. For years, the conventional wisdom was that China held all the cards over Iran. China buys the oil. China provides the economic oxygen under sanctions. China protects Iran diplomatically at the United Nations, so the assumption was that Washington could never use Beijing as real pressure against Tehran. That assumption may now be dead, because for the first time, China has a direct, economically devastating reason to want Iran to stand down. Every day the strait stays closed, China bleeds. And Beijing just told Washington, in front of the entire world, that it agrees the strait must reopen. U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent made this even more explicit on Thursday. He told CNBC, and I want to be precise here, that China has a much bigger interest in reopening the strait than the United States does. He said China will work behind the scenes to the extent anyone has any say over Iranian leadership. And here's the kicker he dropped on live television. Iran's main oil export terminal at Karg Island has had zero oil loaded in days. The U.S. naval blockade is holding. Iran's storage tanks are full. Bessent said, and again I'm paraphrasing closely, that satellite photos show Iran is starting to shut down production because there's nowhere left to put the oil. No ships getting in, no ships getting out. Let that sink in. Iran's oil economy is not just hurting. It is, right now, beginning to physically stop. And what happens when China publicly aligns with the United States on keeping that strait open, and Xi signals interest in buying Texas crude instead, is that Iran loses the one argument that gave it any negotiating power. The argument was always, you need us. The oil flows through us. We can make this hurt. But now Beijing is telling the world that it is actively looking to replace that dependency. Trump said on Fox News that Chinese ships are going to start coming to Texas, to Louisiana, to Alaska. The U.S. plans to ramp up oil and LNG exports specifically calibrated to fill the void China needs. Now, does this mean Xi is fully abandoning Iran? No. Be careful here. The Chinese government's own readout of the meeting did not mention Iran directly at all. That tells you something about how Beijing is playing this, publicly enough to send a signal, privately enough to keep options open. And Secretary of State Marco Rubio was almost comically careful when asked whether Trump had asked China for help with Iran. He said, quote, "He didn't ask them for anything. We're not asking for China's help. We don't need their help." Both men saying something with a straight face that everyone in the room knew was diplomatic theater. Because, of course, China's involvement matters. Of course it was discussed. That's why Trump was in Beijing. But the signal sent to Tehran is unmistakable. Iran has spent 3 decades banking on the idea that its relationships with Russia and China would insulate it from maximum pressure. Russia is consumed by Ukraine. And now China just stood next to America's president and agreed Iran cannot have a nuclear weapon and the strait must stay open. The 2 pillars of Iran's geopolitical insurance policy just cracked simultaneously. And meanwhile, what is Iran doing? Here's where this gets dangerous again. Right as Trump and Xi were shaking hands in Beijing yesterday, a ship was seized near the Strait of Hormuz by unknown parties and was moving toward Iranian waters. A separate Indian-flagged cargo vessel sank off the coast of Oman after an attack. And in the days leading up to the summit, the IRGC was running military exercises it called the Martyr Commander Drills, specifically focused on raising its capacity to control the strait through asymmetric means: drones, fast boats, anti-ship missiles, sea mines, GPS jamming. Not to defeat the U.S. Navy in open battle. The IRGC is not built for that, and they know it. Their strategy is different. It's to make the strait so dangerous and so expensive to ensure that no shipping company will send a vessel through, regardless of what the navies say. That's been their playbook since day one. War risk insurance for Hormuz transits was yanked almost immediately after the conflict began in late February. Protection and indemnity coverage, the critical insurance layer that lets commercial ships operate, became economically impossible to obtain. And that alone, without a single shot being fired at every ship, was enough to collapse traffic through the world's most important energy corridor. The IRGC understands that the economic weapon is more powerful than the military one. Make the insurance unaffordable. Make owners unwilling to send ships. Force a de facto closure through commercial paralysis rather than military blockade. That's the doctrine. And it's been working. Even after a ceasefire was announced on April 8th, shipping traffic through the strait remained far below pre-war levels, but now comes the pressure Iran couldn't have anticipated in its full intensity. China, publicly on the world stage, with every camera rolling, just said it opposes the militarization of the strait in any effort to charge a toll for passage. Iran had floated the idea of creating something called the Persian Gulf Strait Authority, a new Iranian bureaucratic body that would require ships to get clearance from IRGC forces before transiting, a toll system in everything but name, a stranglehold dressed up in bureaucratic language. And Xi Jinping just told Trump in front of the planet that China opposes exactly that. For Iran's hardline IRGC faction, which has been consolidating internal political power throughout this conflict, this is a strategic nightmare. The IRGC has been the driving force behind the strait closure. It has been the entity that benefits most from Iran's leverage over global shipping. It is also the entity most resistant to any peace deal that strips away that leverage. Because once the strait reopens, once Iran stands down, once a nuclear agreement is signed that includes real verification, the IRGC loses its greatest source of power. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps does not want to be defanged, and a Beijing-Washington alignment against Iranian militarization of the strait is exactly the kind of thing that threatens to defang them. So watch the internal Iranian politics here, because they matter as much as the diplomacy. Iran's government is not monolithic. There are factions willing to negotiate. There are factions that will burn the strait down before they cede 1 inch of leverage. And the IRGC is not just a military force. It's a political machine, an economic empire, a revolutionary vanguard that derives its entire identity from resistance to the kind of deal that Trump and Rubio are pushing. Every time there's progress in ceasefire talks, there's an incident, a ship seized, a drone attack, a skirmish, not always by accident. The day Trump met Xi, a ship was taken toward Iranian waters. The day Rubio said ceasefire talks were progressing, there were new strikes near the Lebanon border. These are not coincidences of timing. These are messages from the faction inside Iran that does not want peace and certainly does not want China to help deliver it. Now let's bring this back to what it means for American markets and your financial reality right now. The global economy is already absorbing a historic shock. The IMF warned last month that if the war drags on and oil prices stay elevated, global growth could fall to 2.5%. That's their adverse scenario. Gas prices in the U.S. have risen more than $1 per gallon since February. Airlines are passing costs to passengers. Amazon, FedEx, and USPS implemented fuel surcharges. Food prices are under pressure because fertilizer, largely exported through the Gulf, has become scarce. Over 30% of global urea, which is essential to grow corn and wheat, transits the Strait of Hormuz. When that lane closes, it's not just oil that stops moving, it's food security. If the Beijing summit accelerates a diplomatic breakthrough, if China genuinely leans on Tehran, if the strait reopens even partially, Brent crude could drop $15 to $20 a barrel within weeks. That would be one of the most consequential deflationary events for the U.S. economy in years. Lower oil, lower gas, lower food costs, lower inflation, more room for the Federal Reserve to move, markets would surge. But if the IRGC decides to escalate, if the hardliners double down, if they mine the strait again, if a tanker gets hit in a way that can't be written off as a skirmish, then we're looking at oil back toward $100 a barrel, and the economic damage deepens. And understand this, the U.S. is simultaneously sanctioning the companies that have been moving Iranian oil to China. Just days before the Beijing summit, the Treasury Department sanctioned 12 entities for facilitating Iranian oil sales to Chinese buyers. That's pressure being applied from multiple directions at once. Every ghost tanker that gets hit with sanctions makes it harder and riskier for Chinese refineries to keep buying Tehran's oil at any price. The architecture being built here, if it holds, is a comprehensive squeeze. Military blockade of Iranian ports, sanctions on the shadow fleet moving Iranian crude, a public joint statement with China that the strait must stay open and Iran can't go nuclear, and a commercial incentive for China to switch its oil purchases to the United States, with Trump personally inviting Chinese ships to the ports of Texas, Louisiana, and Alaska. That's not just diplomacy. That's a new global energy order being negotiated in real time. Think about what it means for U.S. energy producers. Texas shale, Louisiana export terminals, Alaska's untapped reserves. Trump is not just fighting a war. He's trying to permanently redirect the most important commodity trade flow on Earth, Chinese oil demand, away from the Middle East and toward American production. If that works, even partially, the geopolitical and economic consequences ripple for decades. American energy dominance becomes structural, not just situational, and China, for its part, has its own reasons to play this game. The Strait of Hormuz closure has exposed Beijing's greatest strategic vulnerability. its dependence on a single choke point it doesn't control and cannot defend. 45 to 50% of China's crude imports used to move through that strait. One conflict, one flashpoint, one set of IRGC speedboats with anti-ship missiles, and China's industrial economy starts seizing. Xi Jinping has spent years talking about energy security. The closure of the Strait of Hormuz in 2026 proved, in the most visceral possible way, that China's energy security is fragile. Buying American oil from Alaska is not just a trade concession, it's a hedge, it's diversification, it's Beijing accepting that its future cannot be held hostage to whatever Iran decides to do with a waterway Iran doesn't legally own but militarily controls. There's a brutal irony buried in all of this. Iran closed the strait to punish the United States and Israel, to make the world hurt, to force concessions. But in doing so, it forced China to confront its own vulnerability. And now China is pivoting toward American energy in a way that could permanently reduce Beijing's dependence on Iranian crude. Iran may have just used its nuclear-level economic weapon and in doing so, convinced its most important benefactor to start looking for a replacement. The law of unintended consequences at a geopolitical scale. None of this is resolved. The strait is still largely closed as of today. Ships are still being seized. The IRGC is still running drills. Ceasefire talks between the U.S. and Iran are still grinding through competing demands. Iran still wants the U.S. to lift all sanctions before it will formally agree to nuclear limits. The U.S. still wants verification and dismantlement before sanctions relief. These are not small gaps. And the IRGC faction that benefits from the impasse is actively working to make sure no deal gets signed. But something shifted this week, something fundamental. The geometry of this conflict just changed. Because for the first time since the war began, both Washington and Beijing are pointing in the same direction, at Tehran. And Iran, for all its asymmetric ingenuity, has never had to face a world where the United States and China agreed on the one thing that matters most. The real question now is not whether China has leverage over Iran. We know it does. The real question is whether Beijing will actually use it, and how hard. Because Xi can make phone calls that move markets. Xi can quietly tell Iranian leadership that Chinese refineries will stop buying their oil if the strait stays closed. Xi can make clear that the sanctions evasion network that has been Iran's economic oxygen supply is about to get